Of all the disasters of the 20th century, the conflagration once called the Great War looms as the one that damaged mankind irreparably. It wasn't just the 22 million who died between 1914 and 1918 in populations dramatically smaller than now. It was a much greater depth. Centuries-old empires met their end. The world lost generations of philosophers, writers, builders, musicians, poets, scientists, healers, artists, the flower and seed of a magnificent continent, dead in mud and misery.
The trench soldier felt by 1916-17 that the war would be endless indeed, and that there would be no survivor standing there, if you will, with the victor's flag at the end. His death was inevitable.
Glory, chivalry, and idealism did not survive. From the horrors were born all the tools, all the monsters for later horror. From beginning to end, it was epic. Its peoples, its battles, its slaughter, its error.
People were full of the notion of sacrifice. And God did they sacrifice?
The millennium that had dawned in 1900 shone upon a European civilization so dazzling that it seemed within reach of every opulent promise of mankind. There had been many sharp, ugly wars over the last century, but now Europe's cunning diplomatic ballet had at last seemed to balance power for a long, prosperous peace. Beyond that, the blood of England's King George V mingled with that of Russia's Tsar Nicholas II, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Austria's Emperor Franz Joseph in intricate marriage alliances. It was Cousin Willie, Nicky, and Georgie. What was to fear? In a Victorian afterglow, England's prosperous island was fed by a treasure fleet of merchant ships connected to its colonies. Its lifelines and shores were protected by the impregnable steel walls of the Royal Navy. 1/4 of the map was England's red. Germany was an industrial miracle, becoming Europe's wealthiest center of industrial might. The formidable Prussian army was brilliantly professional. Its navy was growing fast. Former Chancellor Bismarck had said, "I am bored. The great things are done." France, with its rich overseas empire, had reached an intellectual and economic prominence that made Paris the golden hub of world culture and business. France's spirited army stood behind an iron line of forts that denied the eastern frontier to the Germans. A saying was, "As happy as God in France." Russia was a feudal monarchy that gleamed at the crown. Its sumptuous court hid inner decay, but its titans of literature, music, and dance gave it world stature. Though Russia's armies were ill-equipped by a poor industrial base, they were valiant and huge. But a smoldering revolutionary named Trotsky would observe that history had already poised its gigantic soldier's boot over the ant-heap. In Austria, the 66-year reign of the ancient Franz Joseph was beset by arrogance and the tensions of a polyglot empire always on the verge of breaking into ethnic fragments. But that was nothing new, and the court of Vienna seemed timeless in its waltzing magnificence. Far off in Washington's White House, Woodrow Wilson guided a youthful, happy giant and enjoyed the high, peaceful thoughts of the college professor he had been.
It is correct to say that Americans, by and large, both inside and outside the government, were of the opinion that wars in Europe were really none of our business.
In Sarajevo, Bosnia, on the morning of June 28, 1914, a hot, sunny day of peace everywhere, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria, and his beloved wife Sophie, set forth in an open automobile for a day of military review on the royal couple's 14th wedding anniversary. But 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, an Austrian who belonged to the Serbian radical group called Black Hand, was waiting in the Sarajevo mobs along the parade route. In 2 shots, he fulfilled his mission, killing both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. The Archduke's last words were, "It is nothing," but Princip's small revolver had begun the annihilation of tens of millions.
The assassination, ultimately, of the Archduke worked against the interest of Serbian national independence. Why? Because it gave Austria-Hungary, the government, a pretext to militarily occupy Serbia for good, period.
Soon an ambassador stood before Kaiser Wilhelm asking if Austria-Hungary could count on Germany's support if she mobilized against Serbia, even if Russia came in. Germany said she could, without thinking she might have to.
The alliances were essentially protective. This was an armed peace. Germany felt that it was hemmed in by France and Russia, who of course were allied.
So there had been a German-Austrian alliance since 1879, which had been followed by a French-Russian alliance. At this critical moment, Kaiser Wilhelm went to sea on his yacht for 20 days, described as the greatest maritime disaster ever. Behind his back, Austria scuttled the Serbs' conciliation efforts, sent them a harsh ultimatum, and planned Serbia's subjugation and partition. Now Russia, responding to Serbian appeals against the Austrian threat, mobilized. Austria-Hungary ordered full mobilization, without the emperor knowing that Russia had mobilized on Serbia's side. So began the cascade of mobilizations that was soon to immolate Europe.
This was a time that called for giants, and there were none. You had a lot of men who were in control, who were afraid. They were afraid of what would happen to them, not if they went to war, but what would happen if they didn't go to war.
Entering the fatal August of 1914, the dominoes of dusty alliances kept toppling. Remembering nervously that Russia extended to her East Prussian borders, Germany gave Russia 12 hours to call off mobilization. Next was the preposterous German ultimatum to France, giving her 18 hours to pledge her neutrality if Germany fought Russia, with the French fortresses of Verdun and Toul to go to Germany as hostages. France mobilized. The rest was formality. By August 3rd, Germany would be at war with France and Russia on the side of Austria-Hungary. And it turned out to be rather exhilarating.
War was your chance to distinguish yourself, to put some color on yourself, to put a decoration on your chest, and to know in the face of a large public that you were being valued for being different. War was this opportunity.
Between August 2nd and 18th, France would ship 3,781,000 soldiers in 7,000 trains, a train running every 8 minutes. Germany would speed 1,500,000 men to the west and another 500,000 to the east against Russia.
It's a war about power, about prestige, about colonies, about competing markets. It's not a war about ideology. It's a war about people wanting respect. It's a war about Germany feeling it's being squeezed in and needing to expand. It's a war about settling old scores, the way France was determined to get back Alsace and Lorraine. It's a war about stabilizing empires, as Austria wanted to neutralize Serbia.
Russia was a very impatient nation in 1914, wanting above all, it seems, access to the Mediterranean and to the sea trade routes that lay beyond, and hence it wanted above all control of the straits into the Black Sea.
The supremacy of heavy artillery arrayed in hundreds and thousands and limitless machine guns set behind miles of barbed wire had yet to be shown. Indeed, one attack-minded French general would boast that his best weapon was the living breast of the French soldier. Germany's secret weapon was its war plan, worked out years earlier by one of its vaunted tacticians, General Alfred von Schlieffen. The French, von Schlieffen calculated, would fixate upon regaining the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine and direct their attacks straight eastward towards them and Germany. Von Schlieffen intended no more than a holding action here, with the vast preponderance of his German armies concentrated to the north in a steamroller right wing. That powerful wing would break in a huge wheeling attack through neutral Luxembourg and Belgium. Then the attack could sweep down into France by the back door. The French fortresses facing Germany would be outflanked, and the French armies crushed between German legions from east and west. Neither Britain's Prime Minister Herbert Asquith nor his Foreign Secretary Edward Grey were much interested in Serbia or an ambiguous defense pact with France. To stand aside would not hurt British honor, unless Germany violated Belgium, whose neutrality Britain had guaranteed at the formation of that state in 1831. And there was also the thought of having the rapidly strengthening German fleet right across the Channel in the Belgian port of Antwerp to challenge Britain's sea supremacy. The process was in command. On August 1st, Germany crossed the Luxembourg border, seized the country within 24 hours, and demanded free passage through Belgium. Germany gave Belgium's King Albert 12 hours to agree. He refused and appealed to King George for support. Germany's Bethmann Hollweg voiced astonishment that London would go to war over what he called a scrap of paper. World opinion abandoned Germany, and on August 4th, Britain declared war. The army Britain mobilized was blooded in colonial wars and deeply professional. But it was tiny in this maelstrom, just 125,000 men. The British Expeditionary Force rushed to the continent for what all presumed would be a short war.
They recognized that a modern war with modern weapons, the capabilities of armies and navies at the time, would lead to great slaughter. But for this very reason, the cost, both in blood and treasure, would be so great that the war would have to be over very quickly. This became known as the Short War Illusion.
The von Schlieffen plan was no longer in the hands of its late originator. The General Staff was now headed by General Helmut von Moltke, a gloomy shadow of the Titan father who had engineered Prussian victory in 1870. Von Moltke had been forced to tinker fatally with the von Schlieffen plan when a massive French offensive on his left wing in Lorraine threatened to cut off the German armies advancing through Belgium. So where Schlieffen had demanded a left wing with only 9% of the forces on the right, von Moltke had to divert 42% of his armies there. The British Army had deleted the entrenching spade from its equipment. Audacity, audacity, always audacity was the French credo. Their horses were ready.
All the powers, England, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, held these great reserves of cavalry equipped with swords and lances, ready for the ride through to victory.
On August 4th, 1914, the cavalry spearhead of 60,000 Germans hurtled at the mouth of the Liège gateway to Belgium. The batteries of great forts dominated the attack corridors. Some 25,000 Belgians manned the defensive works, and the bridges over the Meuse River had been demolished. The Germans found the going heavy, their attacks sinking bloodily in the Meuse. But a German legend was being born. An obscure colonel of Fusiliers, Erich Ludendorff, became separated from his own unit in the confusion of battle. In the chaos, Ludendorff shone. He got the milling German cavalry onto the right road to swing behind the Liège defenses. When a commanding general fell, Ludendorff leaped into his place, entered Liège, and became Germany's Wagnerian hero. Lost in the battle smoke was the real hero of the siege, the war's first secret weapon, enormous 420mm siege guns that wrecked the thick-walled forts one by one with man-sized shells.
We might say now that the Germans had no sense of public relations. And they proved that again and again in their invasion of Belgium and of northern France. There would be suspected guerrilla action, and they would simply line hundreds of men from 8-year-olds to 84-year-olds up against a wall and kill them.
They burned the great library of Louvain, one of the great centers of culture in the Middle Ages. And the legend of the raping, burning, murdering Hun would be a formidable weapon in the hands of Allied propagandists. The ghosts of the murdered Belgians would form themselves in armies, haunting Germany to its death. With the war only days old, the German momentum was building as they plunged deeper into Belgium, heading for Namur and the Meuse. The French Chief of Staff, Marshal Joseph-Jacques César Joffre, massive, pugnacious, remote from the welfare of his troops and the true situation, followed von Schlieffen's script like one of his soldiers.
The French attacks in Lorraine, it had to be Lorraine and Alsace because part of the rhetoric was getting the lost provinces back. They were destroyed by the Germans. Do you realize that the French lost 300,000 men in the first 3 months of 1914?
In England, its hero war minister, Field Marshal Lord Horatio Kitchener, the legendary Kitchener of Khartoum, saw things with brutal clarity. Kitchener argued that the Germans were readying their knockout punch through Belgium. He saw the British officer corps as the preserve of gentlemen who dislike having to take their professions seriously, and stated that the war would be won by the nation with the last million men. Squarely in the path of the huge and onrushing German right wing, the scant 100,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force deployed where the Belgian front hinged on the mining center of Mons. The British commander, Amiable, skittish Sir John French was nowhere up to the job, but was blessed with a brilliant subordinate, tigerish General Horace Smith-Dorrien. French's position lay squarely in the path of the belligerent gambler General Alexander von Kluck, leading the powerful First Army, northernmost force of the German Wheel. Von Kluck rushed directly at the best-trained riflemen in the world. So deadly was the fire of the British professionals that the Germans could not believe they were not up against machine guns. Their dead piled up. Although German artillery finally drove the British back, Mons was taken as a British victory, and the survivors were thereafter called Mons men and wore a special medal called the Mons Star.
The French in particular were so inexperienced with war come 1914 and so untrained in the future conduct of war that they sent soldiers to the front, this in the fall of 1914, in red pants. Lo and behold, because of course the German machine gunner could spot them in a second. This practice was immediately changed.
Joffre remained blind to the mortal danger to his armies. His futile Plan 17, the frontal assault of the German center in Lorraine, was stopped cold. The French made no use of stealth, ground, or short rushes. They chanced all on audacity and died for it. To the north, the gallant British Expeditionary Force was being expended in a series of tragic battles, sometimes to slow the Germans, and sometimes because the exhausted men had strength to shoot, but not to walk. Von Moltke's grip was closing upon Paris. But where were the reports of huge prisoner bags and captured guns, the only sure sign of a foe defeated? The one bright spot in the Allied picture was General Joseph Simon Gallieni. Gallieni was old, he was retired, but he was the best of the French generals. And he was pulled out of retirement to set up defenses around Paris.
The French government was prepared to evacuate Paris. Women were weeping in the streets.
So unstoppable seemed the German wheel on Paris that General French proposed a retirement of the British Expeditionary Force to England. Only a furious rebuttal by Kitchener held it. In England, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle spoke of the most terrible August in the history of the world. One thought that God's curse hung heavy. Von Kluck, meeting galling resistance and beginning to feel his overextension, began the undoing of his rampaging right wing by invoking a crucial change in the plan that had served him so well. Instead of swinging southwestward around Paris, he began turning inward to the south to pin the French armies between two German forces. This presented the flank of his army, already weakened by two corps sent to East Prussia on the Russian front, to a flanking counterattack from forces in Paris. This seemed not to concern his impetuous nature. The new aerial reconnaissance capability proved its mettle by spotting the God-sent inward wheel along the Marne. Von Kluck, with the bit in his teeth, drove his stretched, exhausted forces forward.
When men march day in, day out, there comes a point where they get a little tired. And furthermore, they did not anticipate what hauling guns over these distances was going to do to their horses.
Paris began to panic. Crowds demanded that it be declared an open city. Dropped German leaflets declared there is nothing you can do but surrender. Refugees rushed toward the railway stations. Ministers wept. Gallieni responded, "I have received a mandate to defend Paris against the invader. This mandate I shall carry out to the end." Joffre finally began to see the possibilities of the Germans' flank being in the air. He sent Gallieni to see if Sir John French's British Expeditionary Force was ready to join an attack. Sir John became lost in the Gallic language and finally blurted, "Tell him that all that men can do, our fellows will do." The Battle of the Marne was a series of confused, deadly clashes that began on September 5th and bled on through 7 dreadful days. The Germans had not looked to their flanks, and gaps in their line appeared everywhere. They botched their communications, they attacked without reconnaissance or artillery preparation, and advanced in the open against massed fire. All the mistakes their despised foes had made in the early going.
The big wheel was bound to run out of gas. They had gone too far, too quickly. Some days they would average 26 miles marching, and they didn't have the logistical ability to keep up with this march.
At one critical juncture, as the French line began to bend, General Gallieni collected 1,200 French taxicabs to rush decisive reinforcements to the front. It was history's first important use of gasoline-powered mobility in war. Bit by bit, the German wedge fell back to the river end. Paris was saved. Nobody could know it, but the wild mobility that had characterized the war's first weeks in the West was over for good.
Obviously, we will never know what would have happened if the Germans had taken Paris in 1914. But the evidence that we do have on this general issue is that there is nothing to suggest that the French were going to throw in the towel.
Meanwhile, in the east, the death machine had not been idle. The German rebuff on the Marne was more than recouped at the gates of Prussia. While the Battle of the Marne had raged on the Western Front throughout August, the huge Russian army had tried for decisive victory in the east.
The Germans had relatively few troops in the east because their intention was to deal with France as quickly as they could. And they were convinced they could take France out of the war in a matter of a month or 6 weeks. The Russians then started their offensive in what was then called East Prussia.
The defenders of the wide German front covering over 200 miles of East Prussian border numbered barely 135,000 men under General Max von Prittwitz. The Russian armies bearing down on them numbered 650,000 men, an advantage of 4 to 1. They moved in 2 armies commanded by Generals Alexander Samsonov and Pavel Rennenkampf.
The Russians were good soldiers. The trouble was they just didn't have the right arms. Sometimes they didn't even have rifles. They didn't have enough artillery.
Between the opposing armies lay a hump-filled countryside broken miserably with forests, lakes, and marshes. The Russians could deploy only slowly over narrow fronts, enabling the Germans to shift forces over their efficient railway systems. Seeing that the Russian armies would be split upon entering East Prussia and arrive on the battlefield at different times, the German High Command made plans to defeat each in separate turn. Von Moltke misinterpreted an adjustment in the line by von Prittwitz as defeat and retreat, and made a far-reaching decision. He changed commanders. On August 28th, he cabled General Erich Ludendorff, the hero of Liège. "You may yet be able to save the situation in the east." On Ludendorff's train to Prussia, there was a fortuitous meeting. Aboard was General Paul von Hindenburg, called out of retirement. the commanders connected instantly in spirit. Hindenburg and Ludendorff would become virtually one as military dictators of Germany. Hindenburg and Ludendorff proceeded with the plan for which von Prittwitz had been fired. It worked perfectly, helped by the Russian propensity to send radio messages in the clear so that the Germans knew their plans. On August 26th, the huge pivotal Battle of Tannenberg began to unfold. Samsonov drove his split-off army into a trap baited by a purposely thinned German center. As Samsonov wired vainly for Rennenkampf's army to be rushed to his rescue, the Germans methodically crushed his flanks and pinched off his center. When they closed behind him by capturing the rail and road center at Neidenburg, the disaster was complete. There were 92,000 Russian prisoners. Samsonov bade farewell to his staff and walked into the woods. A single pistol shot was heard. Nobody bothered to go into the woods to search for his body.
The German public got the sense that this team of Hindenburg and Ludendorff was a pair of military geniuses who seemed able to do most anything. These two individuals looked to people in Germany in the terrible crisis of the war as the most likely people to bring Germany victory.
Austria had pounced upon the Serbs to take the long-desired territory. On August 16th, a ferociously fighting Serbian army under a defensive genius named Radomir Putnik smashed the Austrian attack at the Battle of the Jadar River.
Then they were beaten by the Russians in 1914. They continually had to call on the Germans to save them. And this happened again and again. It's one of the motifs of that war. And when the Germans saved them, where did the Germans have to get the troops? From the Western Front.
A German officer sighed gloomily, "We are fettered to a corpse." And there was no comfort in the West either.
No one realized the great implications of this many soldiers on a battlefield. Now, in 1914, the machine gun and rapid-fire artillery gave an individual the capability to cover about 3 times the ground that he had before in the War of 1870, and yet there were 10 times the troops.
As the fronts hardened, each side saw its only hope for advantage at the flanks, and there began a leapfrogging series of movements, the so-called race to the sea, to either get around the enemy or to defend against his end runs.
There was no place where you could maneuver. And that became the great dilemma of the war in France and Belgium. How do you get through?
By the end of September 1914, 2 months after the Great War began, the Western Front became a brutal honeycomb of astonishing complexity. The man-height trenches grew underground dugouts for men and horses, galleries to accommodate stores and headquarters, pillboxes, ammunition dumps, traverses, and communication tunnels. And the trenches appeared in successive lines, shrouding themselves in thousands of miles of barbed wire.
Trench warfare was hell on earth. Mud, disease, typhus, rats inside the trenches, gas shells, day after day of cold and filth.
With the front stabilized, it was possible to begin the massing of artillery wheel to wheel in great packs for uses in defense and attack. Artillerymen soon became artists, masters of the creeping barrage and the pre-registered firestorm.
The great killer of the First World War was artillery. Artillery accounted for 70% of the casualties in the First World War.
The Western Front, by the beginning of 1915, had become a line of entrenchments reaching from Switzerland to the Channel, over 400 miles. It was said that a man could walk from Switzerland to the Channel and never emerge above ground. It was more than most men could bear.
With firepower and sheer numbers ending all Western Front mobility in the early war, Antwerp was evacuated. The remains of the Belgian and British forces fell back to dig in on a fragment of Belgian soil in Flanders that would become infamous for 4 years as the war's most lethal ground. Von Moltke's failures had brought command of the German army to General Erich von Falkenhayn. He was enigmatic, dashing, and stopped cold by an old reliable weapon, mud.
If they had overpowered the Belgians, they could have gained the last real prizes of 1914, which were the Channel ports. And the Belgians, under King Albert, opted to flood that flat landscape. And that flooded landscape absolutely stopped the Germans.
Defending the ports with the French, the British Expeditionary Force made a magnificent stand at Ypres, called Wipers forever by the British. The British defensive salient was shaped chillingly like a skull. Within it, 1 million would die or be maimed, slaughtered at triple the rate of any other sector. Kitchener cried out, "This isn't war." The battle died down, and the armies dug deeper.
We know that soldiers began to recognize that the conditions of war, this war of attrition, this bleeding of the enemy to death, was forever changing their lives when they recognized themselves that probably their most important weapon for protection was the spade, not the gun, not the bayonet.
The Germans did something very smart early on in the war, and that was that they gained practically all the high ground on the Western Front.
The nation suddenly understood that this was another sort of war. A munitions machine of unheard-of size had sprung up everywhere. The French 75mm guns alone were spewing 30,000 rounds a day. England was soon turning out 1,200,000 shells a month. The Army's butchery would need every one of them. As 1915 began, the German planners broke into rival camps called Easterners and Westerners, each seeing his own front as the decisive one to break the stalemate. The Hindenburg-Ludendorff team managed to take Warsaw from the Russians, although the enemy retreat into the Russian vastnesses made it meaningless. The Austrians again knocked heads against the Serbs and came out with 100,000 dead and nothing gained. The Germans hoped for more from Turkey.
The Germans were successful in drawing the Ottoman Empire into the war on their side. That meant that they had to fight Russia in the Caucasus. It meant that when British forces landed in what is today Iraq, they had to fight them there. Turkey, although it had lost, the Ottoman Empire had lost most of its European territories, still had the area around what was then Constantinople, is now Istanbul, and the Dardanelles. In other words, the straits connecting the Aegean Sea with the Black Sea. And this was an area of enormous importance because it was the most plausible route by which the Western powers could supply Russia with military supplies.
Although Turkish attempts to break into Russia through the Caucasus in December were bloodily repulsed, the nervous Russians appealed to Britain for a British diversion to ease the threat from the south.
The British and the French were determined to force the Dardanelles. They planned a combined land and naval campaign, the largest amphibious operation probably ever tried up to that point. Winston Churchill, as Lord of the Admiralty, was one of the principal architects.
An attempt by British and French fleets to force the Dardanelles by naval gunpower alone foundered in a series of spectacular sinkings of 3 attacking battleships by Turkish mines and shore batteries. The seizure of the Dardanelles would have to be given over to an army landed by sea. The attack point chosen was the Gallipoli Peninsula, guarding the European side of the straits. Imposing cliffs looked down on the sea with points rising to 1,200 feet. Access from narrow rocky beaches was limited to a series of gullies running up through low, dense scrub. The capable General Sir Ian Hamilton was sent by Kitchener to command 2 divisions of Australians and New Zealanders under General Sir William Birdwood. The Anzacs and a French brigade numbered 70,000 and were destined for valorous calamity, trying for the impossible goals.
They would go over the mountains toward Constantinople, as it was called then, and others would go up into the Balkans. The idea would be to hit Germany from another side. Of course, it didn't work because, thanks to the Turkish machine guns, Gallipoli simply turned into the Western Front gone vertical.
The defenders fought superbly under the capable German General Limon von Sanders, who soon commanded 84,000 Turks. The Gallipoli landings were made from small boats and awkward landing ships, bunching the troops for the murderous fire that met them. The forces were scattered around 4 small and unconnected beaches around the toe of the peninsula. Confused and floundering everywhere, the attackers missed key tactical and strategic opportunities to go forward where the Turks were weak and walked instead into a series of hornets' nests. Quickly, the attacking forces found themselves pinned by Turkish forces on cramped strips of unsheltered beach beneath virtually unassailable heights from which defenders poured down non-stop death. As Turkish reinforcements arrived to freeze the lines, all Birdwood could think to tell his dying soldiers was to dig, dig, dig. The Anzacs did, picking up the permanent name of diggers. Nowhere was courage expended more recklessly or hopelessly than at Gallipoli in attacks on the heights. In 3 days, 1/3 of the assault force had fallen. The Royal Navy came in close to help with big gunfire, but the German submarines were waiting. 3 British battleships went to the bottom. Careers began to dissolve. British Prime Minister Asquith removed Winston Churchill as First Lord of the Admiralty. By July, Gallipoli battle casualties had passed the 50,000 mark. Names like Suvla Bay and Anzac Cove became symbols of useless courage and prodigious waste. Another 40,000 diggers fell in August for what a soldier called 5 acres of bad grazing ground.
What you had as a result It was a terrible, bloody fight that runs through most of 1915, in which approximately 1 million men from both sides fight over this small peninsula, and a quarter of them are buried there still today.
Shortly after a December blizzard froze and drowned 280 men in trenches, the gallant diggers of Gallipoli were pulled out, and hell thereafter would hold no new terrors for them, such as the one they were due to endure on other miserable fronts of this great war, now consuming mankind without end. Now countries with no reason to join the war but promises of plunder came in. For some, the gains would come, and cheaply. For most, it would be a valueless meat grinder.
The nations that came in later came in chiefly for what they could get out of it. Japan, Italy, Bulgaria, whatever.
The German overseas empire was the first casualty of the war. The Japanese came in and picked up their Asian possessions. The British picked up their African possessions. So the German empire abroad ceased to exist in 1915.
Italy had come in for a grab bag of promises of a handful of small territories in the Adriatic and the Aegean seas. The cost would be calamitous, as Italy's armies hurled themselves throughout the war into broken offensives against well-defended mountain crags. The Balkans chose sides frenetically. The Greeks, Serbs, Albanians, Montenegrins, and later the Romanians joined the Allies. Bulgaria went with the Turks and Central Powers. Portugal and Brazil contributed corpses. Britain and France's attempt to aid Serbia from the south by landing at the Greek port of Salonika stalemated 600,000 men so utterly that laughing Germans called it the Allies' largest concentration camp. With the armies at a standstill, the navies had come forward to widen the misery. The Royal Navy expanded the sea blockade of any militarily useful shipments to Germany to include grain, flour, and other foodstuffs.
This blockade was so effective in cutting off maritime supplies to Germany and to the other Central European nations that Germany was soon reduced to a near starvation level.
The furious Germans, casting about for a weapon of retaliation, seized upon their growing submarine fleet. Germany threatened to sink any ship in a British Isles combat zone without warning. Shortly, all neutral shipping was being blockaded out of both countries. Ships went down briskly.
Britain was actually more vulnerable at sea than the Germans were. Britain imported 64% of her foodstuffs when the war started. Germany only 25%.
The British blockade forced the use of the submarine as a commerce raider. But it was a new kind of weapon. Its character, its weakness, its relative vulnerability on the surface required that it attack without warning if resistance was offered.
A peaceful, prosperous United States with a heavy German immigrant population had grumped about unsportsmanlike conduct, neutrality, and the loss of markets, but followed the aloof lead of President Wilson, a plague on all of troublesome Europe. When the Cunard liner Lusitania sailed from New York in the face of printed warnings from Germany, with a passenger register that included a heavy list of American celebrities, the outcome of the Great War swung fatally. On a clear May 1st, in sight of the coast of Ireland, Walter Schweiger, commanding the German submarine U-20, prepared to sink his country along with a speeding liner. Schweiger's torpedoes slammed into the Lusitania, and she went down in 18 minutes. 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, drowned. After that, there was never a doubt that the United States would fight this war. The righteous rage of the United States would never be assuaged. Germany sprayed gasoline on rising flames by refusing to apologize or pay compensation, and lionized Schweiger in its national press. President Wilson's attempt at a calming statement that there is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight backfired. He was scorned as craven for wanting to protect his people from the ever newer horrors that had been appearing on the Western Front. In front of Ypres, with a soft breeze blowing toward the French lines on a day of golden sunshine, colonial troops described two greenish-yellow clouds drifting toward them over 5 miles of front as mists seen over water meadows on a frosty night. In 15 minutes, 5,000 men met slow death. 10,000 were maimed, and utter panic took hold as the heavier-than-air chlorine gas dropped into the trenches. Even the Germans were astonished at the devastation and not prepared to exploit the 4.5-mile gap opened in the line. With the surprise of the terror weapon lost, poison gas became just one more deadly artifact, with gas barrages, fired by artillery and released by gas cylinders, a new constant. Phosgene and mustard gases joined chlorine in the death brigade, and whole companies of soldiers, blinded and asphyxiating pitifully with ruined lungs, were soon commonplace. The smothering gas mask became as dreaded as the maiming. The battles, along with the villages and terrain features that named them, went on. But Artois, Aubert Ridge, 2nd Ypres, Vimy Ridge, Champagne, Loos gained nothing but the growing lists of torn men now nourishing the bright poppies. Joffre sniffed Gillet Grignotte, I am nibbling them. As Kitchener and French faded, with the prospects of quick victory, General Sir Douglas Haig, scion to a whiskey fortune and a man who had failed his Camberley Staff College exams, became head of the British Expeditionary Force. On the home front, England confronted a war that did not end. Posters exhorted volunteers to replace the massacred professionals. The Munitions Act put the whole industrial structure on a war footing. Strikes were forbidden. Munitions workers were frozen into their jobs. And women were invited to leave the kitchen for the plant.
It was deemed morally responsible for a woman to rent her own flat, to wear new fashions, to smoke in public, etc. The war had won the European woman a new-fashioned kind of independence. They deserved, they felt, a reward come the end of the war. The reward was suffrage.
Death arrived at home, too. From 1915 through 1917, immense German airships called Zeppelins, after their designer, were raiding England.
The Germans were bombing cities at far distance from the front. In those days, we tend to forget this, the Germans were very enthusiastic about bombing cities.
The rapid development of anti-aircraft guns and fighter planes softened the threat, and for the first time in history called attention to a new breed of hero, one who lived in the clouds. Barely 10 years after the Wright brothers first flew, knights of the air were dueling miles above the earth. Pistols and bricks had been replaced as weapons by synchronized machine guns and finned bombs. A whole vocabulary was invented: dogfight, air raid, strafing, Spad, Newport, Fokker, spin, loop, aerodrome, and most importantly, ace. While the artilleryman who killed 1,000 men a day on the Western Front was ignored, air kills by the dashing pilots were counted in daily headlines. Von Richthofen, Bishop, Fonck, Boelcke were national gods. Max Immelmann and Raoul Lufbery gave their names to classic air maneuvers and became immortal. Unfortunately, becoming immortal often involved a wingless 3-mile fall to earth while being caressed by flames. Infantrymen who swept up the remains sometimes felt lucky, though not for long. The murderous standoff that the Great War had now become went to sea. A mutually sought showdown between Britain's vast Grand Fleet and Germany's huge High Seas Fleet took place on May 30th. Admiral Sir John Jellicoe's split force blundered into the German fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer off the Jutland Peninsula, and something like a knife fight with 14-inch guns began. German gunnery and armor gave better than it got. A massive 117,000 tons of English warships went down, compared to the 61,000 tons of German losses.
It decided nothing and everything. Jutland was a tie. If anything, the Germans came out a little bit on top. They sunk more ships. On the other hand, the German Grand Fleet was chased back to their bases, and they never emerged again. From that point on, the blockade of Germany was not challenged.
Back on the trembling earth, Austria finally crushed Serbia with German help, and the Russian armies were driven off in front of Prussia. But decision did not appear. The public regard for the heroic Lord Kitchener had fallen so low at the time of his death in a submarine attack that the House of Commons was considering a motion to reduce his salary. Into his place as War Minister stepped explosive, powerful David Lloyd George. English leadership was back, but English war strategy remained insanely the same. Douglas Haig was about to commit a military blunder so great that its cost and horror would haunt the soul of England for the rest of the 20th century. Haig launched an enormous offensive along an 18-mile front against the impregnably fortified chalk hills overlooking the Allied trenches along the Somme. He looked on with stubborn confidence as German machine guns and artillery methodically hollowed out the best of a whole generation of English manhood.
They lost 60,000 troops in one single day. That attack had implications that went far beyond the battlefield. The British, Australians, and Canadians would never forgive the British tactics and techniques that were used on the Western Front in 1916. And that undercut the British Empire.
The graduates of what they call public and we would call private schools, who are the lieutenants and the captains, are killed first. And what happens, therefore, is that you have, if you will, an inversion of the social pyramid, that the next generation of doctors, lawyers, civil servants, engineers, political leaders, are the people who get killed first.
The warrior poet Siegfried Sassoon wrote, "I gaze down into the dark green glooms of the weedy little river, but my thoughts are powerless against unhappiness so huge." Gaines were pallid. The murder went on. Haig drove his slaughterhouse until November, when there was simply nobody left to feed it. By the end of the dismal year of 1916, 607,000 English soldiers had fallen. With the professional army long gone and the core of the volunteer army thrown away on the Somme, the conscription that had begun in 1915 had to feed the death machine. Married men fell with the bachelors.
Whole communities were enlisting in PALS regiments, perhaps most notably the Liverpool PALS. These men would all go into training together, be organized into regiments and brigades together, so that whole communities and local districts were going into battle as one. This was disastrous in the 1916 and 1917 offensives, when whole communities were wiped out.
It was the vilified Winston Churchill who was a leading impetus for a new weapon to break the stalemate. He supported Colonel Ernest Swinton's plea to develop a motorized armored vehicle. The top-secret weapons were shipped undercover and marked as water carriers, which quickly became tanks. One doubting general insisted on the higher value of the horse. No damn design changes. But tanks would be heard from with increasing vehemence, especially in light of what was about to happen at Verdun.
Falkenhayn, in one of those great cynical Western Front moments, decided to attack Verdun, not to gain territory, but to kill people.
You don't tell people this because you cannot tell your own troops that they're being sent into battle not to win this or crush that or break something else. They're being sent into battle simply with the intention of killing more of the other guys than you're losing yourself.
Verdun was the chosen place. The nominal target was the system of forts that had Fort Douaumont as a hub. The attack against it was called Operation Gericht, meaning place of execution. Shells fell at the rate of 100,000 rounds per hour. Scarecrow Frenchmen, blackened, uniforms in tatters, rose up from the charnel house to defend. French trenches collapsed, pillboxes shattered. Douaumont fell. Calm, decisive General Henri-Philippe Pétain began a climb into history when he was ordered in as the savior of Verdun. He ended an order of the day with the enduring words, "They shall not pass." Nobody did on either side. It was after almost 6 months of slaughter that exhaustion and empty ammunition dumps brought the Battle of Verdun to a halt. France had lost 500,000 men. Germany had lost 400,000. Falkenhayn had been somewhat right in his estimate of outcome, except that he was not one step closer to victory. As his men died in mud, others died in sand.
World War I was the first war where oil made a great deal of difference, and that was located in the Middle East. The British wanted to expand their colonial empire to take control of some of that oil. So huge numbers of troops were put into Egypt and then into Mesopotamia.
The British Middle Eastern campaign would go from defeat in Mesopotamia to signal success in front of Palestine under General Sir Edmund Allenby. Colonel T.E. Lawrence would fan the flames of Arab revolt against the Turks and enter mythology as Lawrence of Arabia. Between Lawrence's slashing ambushes and Allenby's deft handling of a 400,000-man army, the Turks would be smashed throughout the war, from Aqaba to Tafila, from Gaza to Beersheba and Jerusalem. In Europe, the cast changed. Von Falkenhayn was replaced as commander of the German army with the hero tandem of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Prime Minister Asquith, devastated by loss of his son in battle, was replaced by the fiery David Lloyd George. As the French kicked Joffre upstairs, General Robert Nivelle, a hero of Verdun, stepped in as commander-in-chief of the Western Front. For all his role in the Somme tragedy, Haig was made a field marshal. In the east, Russia's General Alexei Brusilov gathered all he could for a grim mauling of the Austrian defenses over a 200-mile front.
The Brusilov offensive was one of the great battles of 1916, and though the Russian losses were dreadful, they gained back a huge amount of territory that they had lost the year before.
But it was the last great gasp of the Russian army as it reeled and died of exhaustion of men and supplies. But suffering without progress had begun to rot Russia from within, and that would have consequences much beyond arms. As 1917 opened, Tsar Nicholas was afield with his dissolving armies as his empire went unruled. Heavy rioting began in Petrograd, and police machine guns killed hundreds. Soon the storm spread to other cities. What shall I do, the desperate Tsar asked advisors. You must abdicate, was the answer. He did, and the Romanov dynasty died on March 16, 1917. To destabilize its enemy, Germany smuggled into Russia the arch-revolutionary Nikolai Lenin from his exile in Zurich. From that moment, Lenin worked his way furiously toward ousting all other attempts at leadership, and Russia began a long slide out of the war. But whatever the Germans were gaining in Russia, they had been throwing away in the United States with their sabotage, submarine warfare, and general ham-handedness.
Germany's talent was in uniform. It certainly wasn't in their foreign office. Their foreign minister, Alfred Zimmermann, sent a telegram to Mexico offering an alliance and the possibility of retrieving Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. He sent that telegram over an American-owned undersea cable. It was obviously intercepted, and the Americans learned what he was going to do. And then when it was published in the papers, he doubled his ignorance by admitting that that was his own telegram.
After the Zimmermann telegram episode, war between the United States and Germany is inevitable. Woodrow Wilson, who was elected to his second term in 1916 on the slogan that he kept us out of war, was not a pacifist, as many are inclined to believe. He was, in fact, an interventionist. He must lead the American people into this war that he did not want, but was now inevitable. He brings his message to Congress on the 2nd of April, pointing out to the members of Congress that the Americans have no quarrel with the German people, but America must make the world safe for democracy.
The anti-war forces in America crumbled, and cries of "Kill the Kaiser" and "On to Berlin" rang out. Wilson signed the declaration of war. The United States Army that began to prepare itself for war in Europe was as hollow, depleted, and unprepared as any great nation's army had ever been. It stood at 200,000 men and without a semblance of modern equipment. It would take a dominating leader to shape it up. They had him in a new commander.
John Pershing was a cavalry officer, West Point graduate. He had fought in the last of the Indian Wars. He had done well in the Spanish-American War. He had commanded the 10th Cavalry, the Black Buffalo Soldiers. That's where he got the nickname Blackjack. He had done well in the Philippines in the insurrection. President Roosevelt jumped him from the rank of captain to brigadier general.
Pershing is more important as a symbol, as the man who seemed to be holding it all together.
Not one American soldier would be lost in the immense transfer of American troops to Europe in 1917. Rear Admiral William Sims had met with the British and within weeks had his destroyers online to help protect the huge convoys. The bled-dry French and British were delighted. They wanted every man. "Lafayette, we are here," barked Colonel Charles E. Stanton on July 4, 1917, after the Americans had arrived in France to a rapturous French reception. The citizens could not know that Pershing's big, rough army had been taught to march, but was still learning to fight. They were months away from use on the front.
Pershing was determined to maintain the integrity of the American army, but he was enough of a realist to know that he had to detach American units to British command and French command in times of emergency.
In the meantime, maddeningly true to the mistakes of his predecessors, General Robert Nivelle mounted another offensive to win the war, founded on all the old impossibilities. Although his attack around Arras could not advance, losing 187,000 men in 10 days, it would have one grand result: mutiny.
The army said, "We've had it." And they just refused to fight. Men streamed back to towns in the rear, tried to commandeer trains to go to Paris. They were barely stopped, and eventually ringleaders were rounded up.
A handful of drumhead executions went some distance into repairing the army, but nothing went so far as getting rid of Nivelle and bringing in General Pétain to balance leadership with compassion. He nursed the demoralized army back to health, but it was tired and nowhere near replacing its losses. It needed bodies, strong, fresh American bodies. Georges Clemenceau, the new French Prime Minister, wanted things to hurry up and said so loudly. Concurrently, Field Marshal Haig, attempting to seize the submarine ports and divert the Germans from the French sector, was writing tens of thousands of new names on the cenotaphs of British villages. He chose Flanders for his latest dream of penetration, notably in front of Ypres, for a third battle in a sorry bogland before ravaged villages. One, a magnet for mud and death called Passchendaele, would be remembered with shudders for generations.
There was nothing like the mud of the Great War. It was a liquid sea. The horses drowned in mud. The wounded slipped beneath wood and died not of their wounds, but actually being drowned as well. You couldn't supply troops. You couldn't move. It put a mental state into a soldier that was automatic depression.
However, there was a glimmer of hope at Cambrai, where an attack led by 324 tanks, speeding at 1.5 miles per hour, gained more ground in 6 hours than had been taken around Passchendaele in 4 months. In Italy, the Germans went to the aid of their hapless Austrian ally and smashed their foes for them. In the fall of 1917, they drove into the Italian army in the Battle of Caporetto and broke it in 20 days. Of the 305,000 men Italy lost, 275,000 surrendered. The Italians would need all their fortitude to recover as a fighting unit. Much more important, Russia was about to leave the alliance, taking along its millions of rebelling soldiers. As 1917 waned, Lenin's Bolshevik revolutionaries struggled to throw over the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky and replace it with a Bolshevik dictatorship to take Russia to a separate peace. And when Petrograd regiments stopped recognizing his rule, Kerensky left the city on November 7th, and Lenin was in command. Cries to end the war went up.
The Bolsheviks made a separate peace at Brest-Litovsk with the Germans. This enabled the Germans to move a great number of men from the Eastern Front to the Western Front.
Ludendorff saw that 1918 was going to be make or break for Germany. Huge numbers of Americans were coming in. So he had to destroy the Allied armies that were on the lines in early 1918 before the Americans came. Ludendorff designed an entire new tactical doctrine for the German army in the winter of 1917-1918. Infantry was composed into small packets, 12, 15 people apiece, armed with or built around machine guns or flamethrowers. The key was to infiltrate and then bypass, to go for the rear and keep going. The attack began in the fog on March 21st. There was an enormous artillery preparation, short, very violent, gas and high explosive rounds mixed. When the German infiltration units hit the British front lines, the British simply crumbled. There were 8 British battalions of 6,000 troops there. Only 50 survived.
Their front disintegrated into isolated islands with the German tide flowing around them. Dugouts collapsed and ammunition dumps exploded. The Germans, in what they called Operation Michael, had their breakthrough. The communications hub of Amiens was the immediate target to split the French from the British. Then it would be on to Paris and the English Channel. Ludendorff smelled victory.
Operation Michael was a huge success on the first day. In 24 hours, the Germans gained more ground than the French and British had gained in 140 days 2 years before.
Then their offensive ran out of gas. They reached the old battlefields of the Somme, which were literally a desert. And there was no water. There were few real tracks through it. When they got to the other side, their troops started to loot. They found the kind of food supplies that they hadn't seen in 4 years, and the attack ground to a halt.
The Allies needed an overall commander. General Ferdinand Foch gave his qualifications. I would fight without a break. I would fight in front of Amiens. I would fight in Amiens. I would fight behind Amiens. I would fight all the time. I would never surrender. He was chosen. Operation Michael had overrun 1,250 square miles of countryside and captured 90,000 prisoners. Ludendorff regrouped his exhausted forces to go farther. In these battles, 838,000 soldiers would be killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Nobody could afford such losses. But the Germans could not replace theirs, and the Yanks, at last, were coming. Indeed, they were there.
The first American offensive action at a small village named Cantigny showed the American people that the American fighting man was now in the fight and could discharge himself very well. And it also showed the German high command that the American fighting man was someone to be contended with.
The emergency that brought the Americans into their first big-scale action came when a whirlwind German attack drove a strong salient into the French and British lines behind Chemin des Dames Ridge. Pershing released the United States 2nd Division with its Marine Brigade under General James G. Harbord to the beleaguered area on Foch's frantic request. It was May 30th, Memorial Day. Coming up to Château Thierry, past retreating Frenchmen yelling, "La guerre est finie," the Americans found themselves caught against a riverbank and beating back a determined enemy with point-blank use of machine guns and artillery. Again, Paris was threatened, and again the French government packed to leave, refugees streaming out before them. Pershing cabled, "The possibility of losing Paris has become apparent." On June 1st, the American 3rd Brigade and the Marine Brigade started up the Paris-Metz road to relieve the embattled French. The Germans, wheeling from Château-Thierry, moved astride that road and drove into Belleau Wood, a dense hunting preserve. General Harbord told his Marines, "We dig no trenches to fall back on. The Marines will hold where they stand."
There would be 3 weeks of very vicious fighting, a hard-fought battle. At the end of the 3 weeks, the Marines could say, Belleau Wood, entirely Marine. It was a small victory, but it was one that caught the American public's imagination. It was splashed over the front pages of all of America's newspapers. Marines saved Paris at Belleau Wood. This bothered the Army then, and in some quarters, it still bothers them.
Enthusiasm was wild in America. The people on the home front endured meatless, gasless, and lightless days. They were told, "Lick war stamps and lick the Kaiser." Movie stars staged monster Liberty Loan rallies, and a quarter of the adult population signed on. Ludendorff still held powerful cards, but cabled ominously of the American fighters. Personnel must be called excellent. Spirit of troops is high. Moral effect of our fire does not materially check advance of infantry. Americans were widespread in the forces that now opposed a series of desperate hammer blows from Ludendorff. He termed these his Friedensturm, or peace offensive.
A very large penetration had occurred between the Aisne and the Marne rivers, thrust like a dagger pointed at Paris and the communications of Paris. It needed to be dealt with and pinched off. The Americans devised a plan to do this and restore the line in July of 1918 and had engaged more than 300,000 Americans and sustained casualties of 67,000 during the campaign. The restoration of the line sent the Germans back on their heels one more time. The stage was set for the formation of the First American Army. John Pershing's dream of an American army fighting in France under its own commanders was about to come true.
August the 8th, 1918 was the turning point for Hindenburg and Ludendorff. On that day, Australians and Canadians attacked under Haig's command using 450 tanks and achieved immense success against the Germans. The Germans started surrendering in droves. When Ludendorff rushed in reinforcements, they arrived in the rear areas and they were met with jeers and not cheers. The German troops there saying that the reinforcements were simply prolonging the war.
Pershing got his first chance to show what an American army could do in September at Sammy Hill, a bulge in the line. He pinched off that Sammy Hill salient in classic fashion, hitting the shoulders from both sides. Some folks say that the Germans were already withdrawing from Sammy Hill. Well, perhaps they were, but they were withdrawing because they knew the Americans were coming.
Foch had demanded American troops be blended into his forces for a huge critical Meuse-Argonne offensive coming hard after the Sammy Hill operation, and Pershing had refused him. "Do you wish to give battle?" Foch had taunted. Pershing had snapped back, "Certainly, but as an American army." When Foch said, "I insist," Pershing replied, "You may insist all you please, but I decline absolutely to agree." On September 26th, the Americans were fighting in the Meuse-Argonne as a unit under their own commander.
Meuse-Argonne was the first seriously contested American offensive, and it floundered. Pershing had ordered an attack on line, and that meant that any serious resistance received in one sector would stop the entire line. The Americans were fast learners, however. Pershing changed his instructions to his commanders. They would no longer have to attack on line. He gave initiative to battlefield commanders. He was running out of troops, so he stripped down the rifle companies from a strength of 250 to a 175. Also, he started stripping out troops from divisions in the rear. And then he fired commanders. He fired several division commanders and one of his 2 corps commanders. So when the attack resumed in mid-October, the Americans had it right and they started moving.
On the American front, the Germans had established 4 successive defense belts up to 20 miles deep. On one flank, the Germans held dominating heights looking down the Americans' throats. It was the greatest concentration of defenses that American troops would meet in 2 world wars. Foch's attitude was, you asked for it, you got it. But the Americans drilled forward with growing, unstoppable confidence and power.
In the words of the once skeptical General Ludendorff, when asked who won the war, was heard to say, the American infantry.
The Germans and their allies were suddenly cracking everywhere, from the Western Front to Greece to the Middle East.
The new replacements that are coming in from German urban areas and the siphoning off of the very best German soldiers as stormtroop soldiers has resulted in a qualitative lessening of the fighting quality of the German army.
Ludendorff, the Iron Man, now suffered complete nervous collapse, alternately weeping and raging at his staff, his Kaiser, and his people for the war's failure. Socialists wearing red armbands surged through Germany's streets, mugging German officers and tearing off their epaulets and decorations. The fleet mutinied against Admiral Scheer's order, putting it to sea for a last battle, murdered officers, and sailed back to port with red flags flying. On October 4th, armistice negotiation offers were sent secretly to America's president, with the feeling that the liberal, idealistic Wilson, who had written a rather gentle 14 points of basis for world peace, would be the spokesman they wanted against the ferocious French, British, and Italian belligerents.
Wilson was seeking to put himself in the position of arbiter mundi, empire of the world, able to, if necessary, dictate the peace settlement. He had in mind dictating, if necessary, to the Allies as well.
The Hindenburg Line was broken. Turkey would quit the war on October 30th, Austria on November 3rd. The Kaiser now dismissed Ludendorff. The old German god of war donned a false beard and dark glasses and fled to Sweden. It was the finish. A German armistice commission met at 7 a.m. in a railway car on a siding in Compiègne Forest. And when a German asked for his proposals for an armistice, an icy Marshal Foch growled, "I have no proposals to make." The Allies were willing to keep fighting. The Germans gasped at the terms that ended their hopes of keeping anything for themselves. The Great War was to end at 11 a.m. on November 11th. Retreating German armies wantonly destroyed towns, orchards, coal mines, and art treasures. The bitterness would soon be richly returned by demands that economy-shattering German indemnities repay ravaged civilians $32 billion for damages of the war. The cream and gold imperial train rolled out in darkness and deposited the Kaiser across the Dutch frontier. He spent his years of asylum in numbing disregard. On November 11th, remembered forever as Armistice Day, Hindenburg wept and the guns of the Great War fell into eerie silence. Birds were heard again. Troops wandered out of their animal lairs and blinked in the quiet sunlight. There was little drinking, survival being intoxication enough. The Allied home fronts exploded in hysterical joy as mixed consternation and relief swept a bewildered German public. A German corporal named Adolf Hitler, then huddled in a sentry box guarding Russian prisoners at Traunstein, would have the day's events burned into his seething brain.
The peace settlement, group of settlements that is then made with Germany, with Austria, with Hungary, with Bulgaria, with Turkey, is a whole series of treaties negotiated in and signed in Paris and its suburbs. And these treaties are often very heavily criticized. The terrible dissatisfaction of the Germans with it was essentially dissatisfaction over the fact that they hadn't won the war. That having lost the war, they were not going to get everything they had hoped, I must say, does not seem to me particularly surprising.
When asked by a shocked German what history would say of this, the French tiger Georges Clemenceau would say, "It will not say that Belgium invaded Germany."
In trying to sum up the war, there was no language that could really express what had happened. All of the widows, the orphans, the lost limbs, the millions of dead, it was mind-boggling and it was mind-numbing. There was no way to express what had happened.
Dead or wounded, over 9 million Russian soldiers had fallen, along with better than 7 million Germans. 7 million from Austria-Hungary, 6 million from France, and 900,000 from the British Empire. More than 200,000 Americans fell in just 7 months of battle. The Great War had killed 22 million. Soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force's 4 black regiments, who had piled up battle casualties in the Argonne, were told that they could either be discharged to stay with French girls they had married or return home alone. Wilson returned home to begin a long fight with Congress in his desire to have the United States enter a League of Nations. He was bringing his case to the people on grueling tours when a stroke took him out of the last fight of the Great War, and a losing one. His League would die without America. The American Expeditionary Force and the other Allied armies came home to the greatest parades there had ever been. But the cost of the Great War was greater than could ever be shown. Gone with so many soldiers was a centuries-long age of hope in the possibilities of human intelligence, of kindness and greatness. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires had ended their time at the center of Europe, and the British Empire had been fatally wounded. American innocence was in the past. What had been lost in art, treasure, health, genius, and joy could never be reckoned. Nor could the tears of those who waited forever for the return of the 22 million who slept under a shattered world. These wounds couldn't heal. And so, in 21 years, the bleeding would begin again.